So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Healthy Habitats of Bones, Orca, Trees, and People. My name is Geof Donovan. I wear a lot of hats, along those kill whale drills and sound lunching. I will be your MC this evening. I'm going to start with one of the great people I've known for some time. Would you please welcome to the stage from ACS, the American Cetacean Society, Joel Solf.
Hey, so I'm just going to give a really brief introduction. We've got a so for those of you who don't know, and I think a lot of people here trees well, the American Cetacean Society is the world's oldest whale life conservation organization. It's founded in 1967. And there's been a chapter here for quite a while. This one was reorganized in 1999. And the emphasis of this chapter is taking an ecosystem approach to marine mammal conservation and education. So this talk tonight is just really right in line with what we've been doing now for almost 26 years. And I'm very excited about it. One of the first topics we had was back in 2000 or so, when we had Peter Ross, who was talking about the toxins that were found in killer whales. This was brand new study. At that time, the pollution became a really big deal. Over the years, things like diet and noise and voting interactions also became very important. All three of them were important for the health of the southern resident killer whales. But I haven't seen a lot of emphasis on pollution for a while. So tonight we're going to get that. I'm really excited about it. Okay, now back to this Jennifer Godfrey who's scope.
Thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to everyone who helped make this possible. I grew up here in Rescue Rehabilitation Marine Mammal Facility, learning about the many ways humans harm animals and healthy life. In April 2024, I was shocked to see that Seattle's growth plan to draft environmental impact statement did not include critically endangered southern killer whales. It read, the only ESA listed or state-listed species known or expected to use habitats in the city are fish. I'm very grateful to Kirsten Mole for telling me to read NOAA's Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery Plan, along with other urban ecosystem literature, but even the other EIS tutorial. Kirsten and I first hoped that these were enforceable laws, but the plan specifies they are recommendations. Despite this not being law, you would think Seattle would want to follow recommendations written by top experts in that field. The recovery plan says, because of projected human population growth in the region in the coming decades, especially in Puget Sound and the Georgia Basin, greater efforts will be needed by governments, industry, and the public to minimize pollution. Around when J35 Western 17 will have, the Office of Planning and Community Development not only omitted Orcas from the DEIS, they added language on page 1139 of the final EIS saying managing habitats in the city to maintain wildlife populations in numbers comparable to past estimates is not feasible due to the damage caused by Euro-American colonization. Joe Wilson asked if anyone was going to appeal this EIS. I didn't know that was possible. But the killer whales needed a seat at the table. Our appeal was dismissed on what I feel is a questionable interpretation of the State Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA, exemptions. We are continuing to fight this dismissal in the Court of Appeals right now, and I am so grateful to the incredible long-time public interest attorney, Toby J. Trees are powerful bioremediators, reducing and filtering the polluted runoff, recommended by King County DNRP, the EPA, and the USDA. King County cites polluted runoff as the leading cause of water pollution in Puget Sound. Even the most sophisticated wastewater treatment facilities in Seattle cannot remove those toxic chemicals as trees can. Many storm drains in Seattle release untreated water into the sound. Trees cool salmon waterways even when they are not directly adjacent. Just as trees fight the heat island effect, cooling the air helps lower water temperatures. I would like to ask Seattle to follow NOAA's Southern Resident Recovery Plan and preserve their water holders, large trees. There's a QR that will link to a customizable email. The sapling can't replace the ecosystem services of a mature tree for over 25 years. They are not a one-to-one replacement, and here's why. Size matters when it comes to trees. A 60-inch Douglas fir tree can absorb 13,499 gallons of rainwater per year. A 3-inch Douglas fir sapling absorbs 296 gallons in the same year. Here's a quote from the USDA. In fact, the faster and bigger a tree grows, the harder it works to take out pollutants from the soil and nearby water sources, such as surface streams and below-ground aquifers. Bigger trees are like bigger straws. They can suck out more contaminants much faster than smaller, slow-growing trees. Shoreline canopy assessment showed their tree canopy prevented 227 million gallons of stormwater runoff, resulting in $2 billion of stormwater savings. Why doesn't Seattle's canopy cover assessment include stormwater data like our neighboring cities? Personally, I've been calculating stormwater services provided by private property trees removed last year, since removals were not accounted for in the environmental impact statement. So far, I'm doing around 900,000 gallons, and I'm only about 40% through the legally permitted removals on private property, which does not include removing street trees, infill removals, or parks. The southern residents are telling us they need significantly more help, not more polluted runoff. But you can join me in asking Seattle not to pave over orca recovery efforts. When it's good for orcas, it's good for us, surprisingly. So I'm so honored to have met these incredible experts and so grateful to have them here tonight. And thank you all for coming.
All right, we're going to move into the keynote part of the evening. And our first keynote speaker is standing here right next to me. That is bio defined, so I'll read it directly. So this is Dr. Geof Donovan. He earned his PhD in forest economics at Colorado State University in Oregon. It's been 23 years as an economist with the USDA Forest Service in both Alaska and Oregon. He now runs Ash and Elm Consulting, where he continues to make business cases for urban trees. Geof's research has shown that trees do much more than just beautify space. They reduce the summer cooling costs, they do raise property values, lower crime rates, and improve public health. His studies have found that trees can influence everything from infant birth rates to the rate of cardiovascular disease, and he's now exploring how plant diversity might protect us from immune-related illnesses. So with that, you all can Dr. Donovan.
Thank you very much. Let's see if we get this one. There we go. So, impervious surface is what brought us up here today. Specifically, Seattle's goals in increasing impervious surface because of increasing housing density. And there's a whole range of things that comes along with impervious surface, including stormwater runoff, high temperatures, and so forth. But I'm not here to talk this evening about the direct impact of impervious surface. More impervious surface rather. I'm here rather to talk about one of the unfortunate indirect effects. So broadly speaking, in urban areas, you have three types of land habitat. Impervious surface, you have low canopy, which is shrubs and grass, and high canopy, which are trees. So one of the problems, if you get more impervious surface, you're necessarily going to get less of the other two. So what I'm here to do tonight is about the indirect effect of losing tree canopy, which would necessarily flow from having more impervious surface. What are the impacts of losing trees? Well, higher temperatures certainly reduce air quality, more stormwater runoff. I've got work showing that trees can both reduce the total quantity of stormwater flow as well as slow it as well. Let's get lower property values, that means the lower property tax revenues, higher crime, and finally worse public health. And I've done research on all of these outcomes over the years, but I've come to believe that the effects of trees on public health are by far the most important benefit any trees provide. That's the really big one. And so, if we increase impervious surface in Seattle and we lose tree canopy, then I believe there are going to be non-trivial impacts on public health. And what I'm going to do for the next 25, 30 minutes or so is to try and provide some evidence for that sort of wild research. So, I'm going to talk about 3 studies I've done. I've done more, but just 3 studies about trees and health. Now, before I want to talk about results from specific studies, I'd like to talk about one of the problems that you can run into when you're doing research on the health benefits of trees. I do what's called observational research. Simply involves collecting data on the world and trying to identify patterns. That's all you do. But one of the problems you get when you're trying to look for patterns day in, day out, what do you tend to see? You tend to see patterns. So you start to think that NFL teams with more vowels in their name are more likely to win the Super Bowl, or baseball teams with white uniforms are more likely to get on a Tuesday. Now, I'm not saying those things don't happen. I'm just saying that if baseball teams with white uniforms do win one on Tuesday, a couple of the white uniforms are causing that to happen. So you're seeing these sort of false causal relationships. So how do you avoid seeing these causal relationships that aren't actually there? Well, one really good way is to have a good reason to think that 2 things are causally linked before you ever collect any data on them. So in the case of trees and health, are there reasons to think that trees and health are linked? Or put into life, what would be some of the mechanisms that would link trees and health? And actually, when you think about it, you don't have to actually think about it very long to realize the several mechanisms. So, for example, we know that trees can absorb air pollution. And we absolutely know that air pollution puts you at risk for a whole range of diseases. If we were to go outside now and sit under a tree, our short-term markers of stress would go down. Our survival cortisol would go down. Our heart rate would go down. Our blood pressure would go down. We also know that people living in rural neighborhoods have more social connections. And social connections are profoundly important for our health. If COVID taught us nothing else, it taught us that. We also know that people in greener neighborhoods are more likely to exercise. And Lord knows what we told enough times, exercise is good for us. And then finally, at least for this, we know that tree shade can reduce temperatures, and increasingly higher temperatures pose a health risk to us all. So given that it's reasonable to think that trees could have died off, and nothing they do, but given that's a reasonable thing to look at, let's go back now 14 years into the midst of time to my first ever trees and health study. And in this one, I looked at the relationship between trees and birth outcomes. Why on earth would I look at a relationship between trees and birth outcomes? That seems a little odd. Well, one is a pragmatic reason. There's really good data on birth outcomes. There's really good data on the beginning and the end of life. So with 99% of births in this country recorded, we know birth weight, we know gestational age, we know the demographics we have. So really good data. And that's important for the type of work we do, trade data. Next, and this is really important, there are good reasons to think that trees could improve birth outcomes. Right. We know that women who are exposed to high stress or more air pollution, for example, are at higher risk of adverse birth outcomes. We know that trees can help both of those things. So there's reasons to think this might be the case. So hopefully this isn't going to be quite uniform and Tuesday. Okay? So the specifics of this study, I looked at almost 6,000 singleton live births that happened to mothers in 2006 and 2007 in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. And we looked at a cohort of adverse birth outcomes. First, underweight birth, and then the second was preterm birth, whether a child was born before 37 weeks of gestational age. Now, even the most ardent environmental advocate in this room isn't going to say trees are the only or even a major reason that a woman has a healthy or adverse birth outcome. There's a whole range of things. So we know demography matters. So we took account of race, education, income. We know if a woman's had an uncomplicated birth in the past, she's more likely to have one in the future. We took account of the type of insurance she used and her prenatal care she used. Distance the stuff. So good stuff like parks, bad stuff like freeways. We even looked at characteristics of house, down to its heating and cooling system, whether an air conditioning. We looked at crime around the home, because we know that can be stressing. And only after account for all those things, I want to be very clear, we first account for all of these things, then we looked at tree canopy in 50, 100, and 200 metre buffers around the centre of each house's lot. You can just about see that on the left there, this is an aerial photograph. And there are sort of, these aren't within from the average sample for within cities. And green rectangles there, that's the lot, the edge of the woman's lot, with the red dot in the centre. And then on the right, you have what's called classified area lineage. You take a computer algorithm, you break that picture into 1 meter pixels, and then you classify it as either tree canopy, which is the green, or not tree canopy, which is the off-white. And then I just put the 50 meter buffers in there for clarity. So let's just come to the cut to the chase. What did we actually find? We found that women who had more tree canopy within 50 meters of their homes were significantly less likely to have underweight babies. Well, this is interesting, but maybe this is a way uniform to the Tuesday thing. Maybe this is a statistical anomaly. It's not the worst explanation, frankly. And I think this study back in 2011. But then a few interesting things happened. 2012, a friend of mine in Spain did a study looking, and he found that women with more greenness, and they measured this, wasn't just trees, within 100 meters of their homes had higher birth weights. So consistent results. 2013, a team from California found that women with more tree canopy within 50 meters of their homes had higher birth weights. Consistent results. 2014, a team in Germany found that mothers with more greenness within 500 meters of their homes had higher birth weight. Again, consistent results. 2014, again, a team in Canada found that women with more greenness within 100 meters of their homes had higher birth weights. This is an interesting one because the guy who did, the author, told me to his face, he thought my study in 2000 was bullshit and he went out to disprove it. And he had it. He was nice enough to tell us. So that was fun. I can actually go on at a really tedious length. Since my paper was published in 2011, there's been at least 30 studies that have found a link between greenness and maternal birth weight. Now, could one study be an anomaly? Sure, absolutely. Could 30 studies be an anomaly? Yeah, but it's a lot less likely. Now, let's just take a moment and imagine that I have a healthy weight baby in this hand and an underweight baby in this hand. That the difference between the two might be a mother's exposure to trees during pregnancy. That's something very profound about our relationship with trees. This is really important stuff. Because if you're born underweight or amateur, you're much more likely to have health complications or die. And to some degree, you get put on a health trajectory for life. Kids who are born underweight or immature, they're less likely to go to school, they have lower lifetime earnings, for example. So really, if it can be avoided by something as cheap as a tree, this is a really good thing. Now, I think the link between trees and birth outcomes is interesting. Hardly, I would say that. But it also highlights one of the biggest headaches when you're studying the health benefits of trees, what I call the nice tree, nice neighborhood effect. That is, where are the nice trees? They're in the neighborhoods which are whiter, wealthier, and better educated. And we absolutely know that race, education, and income are important drivers of health. So that's kind of a problem, because you've got these three things, the sort of triangle. You've got your trees, you've got your health, and your demography. And you really want to just look at trees and health, but you have this sort of three-sided thing, and you take statistical steps to try and account for the demography, but you can never be absolutely sure that you've done everything. And about 12 years or so ago, I was really bothered by this problem. When I realized I could flip my hypothesis on its head. That is, if trees are good for you, which is my general hypothesis, then killing them should be bad for you. Right? Why is that such a grand revelation, or at least for me, passes for a grand revelation? Well, because it opens up some new methodological approaches, because trees can die a lot quicker than they can grow. So you can look at large changes in tree canopy in a short period of time. In a way you can't if you're going to bore yourself to death waiting for the things to grow. Okay? And the other thing is, trees are related trees at one point in time, like in this neighborhood, are related to race, education, and income. But tree loss over time need not be. Could be, but it need not be. There's nothing to say that tree loss over time has to be correlated with race or education or income. So maybe looking at tree loss is an interesting way. Maybe it's a way of kind of sidelining those pesky demographics, and really isolating that relationship between trees and health. Okay, but to do this, you will need two things, two conditions. One, you have to have something that kills a lot of trees in a short amount of time. Because certainly, a few trees dying isn't going to have a measurable impact on health. And you also need to make sure that the loss of trees wasn't correlated with race and education or income. What could do that? Well, this handsome little chap could. Anybody know who this is? This is Edward the Appalachian Shower. Just arrived on the West Coast in 2022. And if we're all going to get very familiar with him, unfortunately, this is what he can do. This is Toledo, Ohio in 2006. This is the same street 3 years later. So clearly, it can kill plenty of trees in a short amount of time. So that first condition would hold. But does the pattern in tree loss, is that correlated with race, education, income? Well, let's look at this little map. It shows it spreading from Detroit in 2002, for 20 years until it was arrived in Oregon in 2022. And as you're watching this spread, can you imagine, is this the sort of pattern where you get a change in race or education or income? It's not really. Demographics don't change this way. And you don't have to take my word for that. I've run the stats. And what you find here is that this spread of emerald ash borer and the loss of trees is uncorrelated with race and education or income. So it's a real statistical gift. So if we do see a relationship between this loss of trees and health, it's much less likely to be caused by other things. That is a rather belabored explanation, so I'll stop on the stats answers now. So what type of, I looked at two causes of death in this study. I looked at cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease. Why did I look at those? Well, they're important. They're the first and third biggest killers in this country. And the other thing is, there's good reason to think that trees and men could be related. Right? So there's multiple mechanisms that link trees, cardiovascular, and low respiratory disease. And in this case, I looked at county level mortality. These black squares are US counties. I looked at counties from 1990 through 2007. So you have this 12 years without EAP. You add it in, you wait 6 years, and you see what happens. And what happens is, in counties infested with emerald ash borer, higher rates of cardiovascular and low respiratory mortality. And interestingly, as the infestation progresses, as more trees die, more people die. So this dose-response relationship, more trees die, more people die, which is what you would expect to happen. We also saw that emerald ash borer had a bigger effect in wealthier counties. Why would that be? Correct. More trees in those wealthy counties, providing great benefits. What happens when we take them away? Bigger negative off of that. So that's what we saw. Sorry, I got myself a little. Need to catch up. Oh, there we go. And so across 6 years, 6 years in 15 states, we found that emerald ash borer infestation was associated with an additional 15,000 deaths from cardiovascular disease and 6,000 from lower respiratory disease. So an additional 21,000 deaths. This is not trivial numbers. This is a lot of dead people who didn't have to die. Now, I think the results from the EAB study are compelling for the reasons that I outlined. But again, I'm hardly neutral. But in the years since I did this study, I've wondered whether the opposite was true. That is, if killing trees leads to higher rates of cardiovascular and low respiratory disease, should planting trees lead to lower rates? One would think, right? But, as I outlined earlier, the problem is trees are really tedious. They take a really long time to grow. They take a sort of personal front at this. And so you would need years or decades of planting data. I didn't know where to get these sort of data. And just I started giving up on the idea of doing a companion study. And then probably 4 or 5 years ago, I just happened to be talking to a colleague who works for a Portland-based non-profit called Friends of Trees. Some of you may be familiar with them, great organization. And she mentioned, oh yeah, we've planted 50,000 trees since 1990, and we have the date and the address for every single one that's planted. I couldn't believe it. Bless them, they just happen to be really fastidious record keepers. For no particular reason. They just were. And then I sort of tried to casually ask, do you mind if They said, sure, absolutely. So they gave me access to their data, which was wonderful of them. Again, great organization. And so I had to then get health data to go with that. And I contacted the Oregon Health Authority and got access to census tract level mortality data. For those of you who don't know, census tracts are just geographic units used by the US Census. And tracts, there's 140 of them in Portland, so they're roughly the size of a named neighborhood. So in this study, we could just think of this as we're looking at the relationship between trees and neighborhood level mortality. And we looked at just 2 tree variables, just how many trees have been planted in the last 15 years, that's the total number of trees, and then we looked at the number of trees planted in 5 age bands, 1 to 5 years ago, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. Why was that? Because in advance, before we ever collected any data, you would expect as trees age and grow, that the benefits would get greater. It could be a good thing. For example, as a tree gets bigger, it's going to intercept more air pollution, provide more shade. So if you don't see that in the data, then maybe things aren't going the way you think they are. So it's always good to be, as a scientist, and not go easy on yourself. It's important to check. You can sometimes just ask one question, get impressed with the data and call it good. And it's a temptation not to do that. So let's get to the results. This table just shows those 5 variables in my mind. And in this case, we looked at neighborhood level non-accidental mortality. Why non-accidental? Because there's no way that trees are going to affect accidental death. Right? It's just, there's no mechanism linking trees and accidental death. So we just threw those out. And in common with a lot of greenhouse studies, we just looked at non-accidental mortality. And we found that in neighborhoods where their income was higher, there was significantly lower mortality. Again, not surprising. You see this in public health studies all the time. If you want to live longer, get wealthier. Definitely, it has a depressing effect on income, has a depressingly powerful effect on mortality. Age, neighborhoods where people were older, unsurprisingly, was higher mortality. Again, non-stop depressive stuff. Education, higher education, lower mortality, as you would expect. Race is mildly surprising that wasn't significant. There's a couple of reasons for that, and I suspect one, income and education are already in the model, so to some extent they account for race. And the other thing is Portland's just one of the whitest cities in the country, which just isn't very much variation. So I suspect that's what's going on there. So what about trees? They're the ones, that's the variable we care about. Well, we found that neighborhoods with more tree planting in the last 15 years have significantly lower non-accidental mortality. Now that's great, but you really need 2 things. You want something that's statistically significant, but it has to be big enough to count about. If I said, oh, there was a statistically significant effect, and every 10,000 trees, 0.000013 would say, you're like, oh, okay, not great news. So how big was the effect? Well, we found that on average, planted trees planted 1,638 trees a year. 1,638. And that was associated with 15.6 fuel deaths. That's not nothing. Another way to look at this is roughly 1 life death was averted for every 100 trees planted. Which I think is a pretty good deal. And we're going to return to that in a sec. So now let's look at how trees age and grow. So what I did in this part study is just, let's take those 1,638 trees and then let's wait 1 to 5 years after planting and see how many deaths are averted. In this case, 11.6 across the whole city. Okay, Then let's wait 5 more years, and then grow a little longer, 19.7 fewer deaths, and then a little longer still, 23.1 fewer deaths. So, as the trees get older, we see we have a bigger impact on mortality, which is what we were hoping to see. That's what we did see. You see a graph like this. The effect goes up at a sort of declining rate, which is, again, what you would anticipate in advance. Now, we didn't just look at non-accidental mortality, we also looked at cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease, because we remember this, and so skipped over this, but this is meant to be a partner study to the NOAA study. And that one looked at cardiovascular and lower respiratory disease, so let's see what we can find there. And we found in this case that neighborhoods with more trees planted in the last 15 years had significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease. So consistent with the NOAA study. With lower respiratory disease, it was more marginal. At the 5% level, it wasn't significant, it just about was at the 10%, but really the strongest relationship there was with the cardiovascular disease. So, what does that tell you? I think, and the other thing to note here in both of these two studies is both show dose-response relationship. In the NOAA case, as more trees die, more people die. And in the tree growth study, as trees aged and grow, you saw a bigger impact on mortality. So both had a relationship with cardiovascular disease and both show a dose-response relationship. Right. So that's remarkable. For those of you who aren't scientists, that's a really unusual thing to have studies that are that consistent. These are different, they were conducted 9 years apart, different study areas, different measures of tree loss, different statistical models, very different studies, and yet they're consistent results. And what does that tell you? And that tells you that taken together, these studies really strengthen the statistical evidence that trees are associated with lower mortality. So I've just got a few minutes left here. So now I'm just going to talk about one final thing. Because we were doing a specific thing here, tree planting, we're able to do a cost-benefit analysis. I'm an economist by training, so I can't help myself. And to do this, I had to make 2 assumptions. One, we assumed that the annual planting and maintenance cost of a tree was $58.70. This is from a 2005 study, we just did for inflation. And then we also got help. So if you multiply that by 140, so we've got one tree each in Portland's 140 neighborhoods, that's $8,218. But how do we work out the benefits of saved lives? Well, it turns out the EDA has to do this all the time. I don't want to get into the details, but what they assume is the value saved as what we call one statistical range is $10.7 billion. We could have a whole talk just about that number. So if you just for the time being take that number, I found in my study that planting one tree each in 140 neighborhoods, you'd save 1.33 miles. If we multiply that by 10.7, we get $14.2 million. So that's a benefit cost ratio of 1,727 to 1. But even though Nigerians not scam fees that did offer some results like this, which is quite amazing results. So really, what's the take-home estimate? And that is that awesome treat to increase impervious surface may have negative impact on the health of residents of Seattle, and that the magnitude here may not be true. The effect of losing significant amounts of particularly mature canopy will have non-trivial effects on health. So, I have a thing for the questions, and we're not going to have questions now, but I just put it on. So, see my contact information, and I'm very, very adorable. So, there you go. Thank you.
Awesome. And just a quick reminder again, question the answers will come later. So keep your stuff in your head, write it down. You'll get a chance to talk to Dr. Donovan in a bit. Our next guest speaker, I'm particularly honored to get to introduce. I feel like I talked about her a lot, if she's not listening or around. She's been a friend, a colleague for nearly a quarter of a century, and in my mind, if you're ever going to build a Mount Rushmore to people that actively help to protect the southern resident Kobo, you could do worse than we start with her. So please, Lynne Barre is with us tonight, recently retired from NOAA Fisheries after 25 years. She's been in the news. You may have seen her story the other day. At NOAA, she served as the Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery Coordinator and the Seattle Branch Chief for the Protected Resources Division. Since the whales were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 2005, Lynne's led efforts to designate critical habitat, implement a recovery plan, and put vessel regulations in place to protect these iconic animals. Beyond killer whales, she's also supported recovery efforts of the Puget Sound rockfish, salmon, marine mammals through programs like the Stranding Network. Her background includes marine mammal research in Southern California and Western Australia, and she had spent time with the National Geographic's Critter Camera team, attaching camps to marine animals to learn about the lives of the surface. Could you please help me and help me with Lynne Barre?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lynne Barre. Thanks so much for coming tonight. We live in Seattle. It's an urban environment, and we share it with some great iconic killer whales. How many of you have been out in the waters of Puget Sound or on the shores and have seen these amazing animals? Oh, look at that. Excellent. So you probably know some of what I'll tell you tonight, but I'm excited to make this connection between worker recovery and the ecosystems, the trees, and the health that you just heard about as well. So I'll just start. We have multiple kinds of killer whales in our waters, and I'm going to focus on one particular type today, which is the endangered population, the southern resident killer whales. We also have transients or big killer whales that are in our waters more and more all the time. So those may be the whales you've seen, but it's really a special treat to see this population. These whales live in stable family groups. Their calves live with mom their entire lives. Maybe some of you experienced that as well recently. There's 3 pods of whales, J, K, and L pod. They each have their own unique dialects. This population has unique behaviors. And these are fish eaters. And they tend to eat mostly Chinook salmon, particularly during summer months when they're here in Puget Sound. They use sound to find their prey. They use echolocation. Uko's in the house lists his diagram of how that echolocation works for whales to find their prey. And they can be identified by distinct markings, their saddle patches. And you see some great examples of whales with unique saddle patches around the room. And this is that area right behind the dorsal fin. And we know each individual. They're like a fingerprint, so we can tell the whales apart. And that's really special because it helps us count them. And we've been working with our partners for decades at the Center for Whale Research to do an annual census. Every year they go out and they're able to photograph and identify every whale in the population to see who's still around, which moms have had new calves, which whales might be missing from the population. And this has been tremendously helpful information to track the health of the population over time. So I'll point out, unfortunately, we had an almost 20% population decline in the late 90s. And this is about the time when the whales were petitioned to be listed as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. And so that we did in 2005. You can see we've had some ups and downs with the population, all with mostly a downward trend. This is the total population here at the top, and we've got JK and Telcon individually there. So why were these whales listed as endangered? What threats do they face in this beautiful ecosystem that we share with them? Well, the main threats that were identified at the time of listing were prey. They're Chinook salmon eaters. Some of our Chinook salmon are also listed as threatened and endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Do they have enough prey to eat, to maintain their lifestyle, to go where they need to go? Do they have enough prey to successfully reproduce and take care of their babies? So that's one of the legs of the stool for recovery. Next, I mentioned these whales use sound to find that food, and vessels and other sources of sound can interfere with that echolocation. They're also very social animals, and they have those unique dialects and talk to each other. We don't know exactly what they're saying to each other, but they're very social. And so vessels and sound can interfere with that social cohesion, that communication, as well as their foraging. And we have a number of scientists who've been studying these different threats. And the one that I'm really going to focus on today, because that's the primary link we have, is through contaminants and prey as well. I'll talk about that. These whales are at the top of the food chain, and they live a long time. They have, not too different lifespans than we do, living post-reproductive lives into their 60s, 70s. So they can accumulate contaminants over their long lives, and they accumulate that up the food chain as well. So these are three main threats. I've got lots of arrows here on the slide to remind me and remind you that they're all linked, they're all connected. So if there's not as many Chinook salmon out there, and vessels are sound, or perhaps making it harder to find and catch those prey that are in the environment, that's when the whales might use their blubber a little bit more, and that's where some of those harmful contaminants can be stored. And if they're using their blubber, those contaminants getting released into their systems, that can affect their reproductive and also their immune function and make them more susceptible to health issues and disease. So these are all linked, they're all connected. I also showed you what a small population it is, 70 plus whales right now. This small population, there's also new studies that show inbreeding depression that can affect their population growth as well, because it's such a small group. So lots of threats, far-reaching threats throughout our whole ecosystem. Saltwater, freshwater, human activities are clearly related to all of these things. And so what are we doing about it? How can we address those threats and put these whales on the road to recovery? We wrote a recovery plan, which I was so thrilled to hear Jennifer quote from tonight. I spent a couple of years working on writing that with many partners and having lots of public and agency input into that recovery plan. Our recovery plan under the Endangered Species Act was completed in 2008, just a couple of years after the listing. And more recently, we've taken that comprehensive plan, that's a long-term actions, how to prevent extinction, how to get these whales recovered. We've focused on kind of what's the most important thing over the next few years through a program called the Species in the Spotlight program. This is something that NOAA did to identify some of the most at-risk endangered species across the country and shine a light, put a spotlight on them to increase awareness about the threats they were facing and to bring new partners to the table to help with recovery actions for these species. So not surprisingly, the recovery plan and the Species in the Spotlight action plan have focused on those main threats: prey, vessels and sound, contaminants, and health of the whales. So let's start with prey. And I'm just going to throw a little bit of data at you as well. Here we've got a pie chart that shows how big a portion of their diet Chinook is, so Chinook salmon. And how we know they're eating Chinook salmon. We've got our research teams out on the water. They're using their very sophisticated techniques. Yes, that's a pool net. Scooping up scales and tissue samples and feces behind the whales to be able to identify what's in their diet, what types of salmon are they eating, where and when. And we also are able to take aerial photos using drones to look at, how much food they might be getting. Are they looking healthy, like this very plump, actual pregnant female? Or are they perhaps not getting enough to eat in certain places and times of year and are thin and are in a poor body condition? So that's some of the research that's gone into the work we've done to assess how much prey are they getting and how can we protect the critical prey that the whales need? So this is a lot of words. This is from the recovery plan, but I really just want to focus on a couple of words that are linking this prey issue to what we just heard about with trees and health, the environment, and people as well. So right in our recovery plan, talking about rebuilding salmon populations to support the prey for the whales, we have a whole section on habitat management for salmon. And this could be a whole talk on its own, I'm sure, tonight with salmon experts as well. But really from these building blocks in the recovery plan, we identify that management of future growth and development, we had to be aware of the watershed processes, do better management of stream flow, focus on water quality, and it talks about chemical contamination and stormwater management. And you heard earlier, stormwater is one of the biggest inputs of contaminants into Puget Sound. So right there in the recovery plan, there are recommendations, there's some guidance of what we can do to help support the prey that the whales need. I'm newly retired-ish from NOAA, and but I wanted to give a shout out to some of my NOAA colleagues for some of the work that they're doing. We have a recovery plan for Chinook salmon in Puget Sound, and there's a wealth of much more detail about those habitat management issues, about chemical contamination and how that affects salmon, about water quality, temperature, cool fresh water that they need. And there's also many actions that have been taken by watershed groups, by partners, tribes, the state of Washington to address those habitat issues for salmon and many other issues for salmon as well. And I'd love to see if this was still on our website or NOAA's website, and it is. This is some of the Inflation Reduction Act funding that's been flowing in recent years to support states and tribes to look at passage, to look at habitat, to look at making sure that waters are clean and cool for salmon to recover. And there's even a program that's so connected to what we're talking about today is Seeds for Salmon, and how to encourage planting, but also conservation of established trees and riparian areas. How plants can shade and keep the waters cool so that the temperatures are the right for salmon to migrate back up the rivers and spawn and reproduce and be successful there. And also to reduce runoff and pesticides. It's great to hear some more details about how trees are those straws to suck up contaminants and how those effects on human health. We can also make those connections to salmon health and to orca health as well. I'd also make a case for the seeds, for the riparian brush, for the trees, that they're going to help these species in these environments be more resilient to climate change. That cool water, we're concerned about sea level rise and how that could bring new contamination into our marine systems. So having these great cool, clean waters for the salmon in both freshwater and saltwater will help that climate resilience and help us ensure that these salmon can recover and survive into the future. So now we'll talk a little bit about contaminants threat to the whales and their health and those links. And here's another great graphic from the Encyclopedia for Puget Sound that really shows the whole food chain and their involvement. These contaminants are more abundant in our urbanized and developed areas, and they go into the food web, they go into our waters, and go up the chain into those lovely Chinook salmon that the whales like to eat. And the way this works at the top of the food chain, although it's on the bottom of the figure here, is that the whales accumulate contaminants. For every contaminated salmon that they eat, they're building those contaminant levels. And how do we understand what the levels of contaminants are in these whales? Well, we used to go out and take small biopsy samples. This is a tiny little bit of skin and blubber, and then we can do a myriad of studies. And here are some of the results. I just picked one. I picked total PCBs to show you tonight. And this is J, K, and L pod. You can see there's different patterns. These different symbols and colors are males and females and adults and juveniles. You can see we have some whales with very high levels of these contaminants. And there's a blue line here in this figure. That's actually a level that causes health, immune, and reproductive issues in other marine mammals that are easier to study. Our resident harbor seals here in Puget Sound. It's really tough to study these southern residents, but we can take those cues and learn from patterns in other species. So they're above thresholds that can cause these impacts. We know that the whales accumulate these their whole lives. Particularly males. Males get the worst deal because they just accumulate throughout their lives and they can live for decades. Females, good and bad, they can offload some of their contaminants to their calf during gestation and particularly when they're nursing. And they have very fat-rich milk so that those contaminants can bind to the milk and then be transferred to the calves. So this is one of the things we're worried about for our cows when they're born is this high level of contamination that they can get from mom. So this is just a little bit of the background of what we know, why this is an issue, and so let's talk a little bit about what we can do and how we can address that. Well, in the recovery plan, again, lots of words here, but I just underlined stormwater runoff as one of the ways we can address and minimize the levels of harmful contaminants released by non-point sources of pollution. There's also recommendations in the plan about point source pollution, all different types of urban contamination sources. And then we've got a recommendation for improved watershed planning and implementation of best practices. And this ties directly to some of the work that we heard about earlier with the EIS and growth management plans. There's a recognition right here on the recovery plan for southern resident killer whales that these things are connected and they're linked. And that we need to be aware of what's happening as we have population growth in our area and development. So some of the efforts out there, some colleagues here tonight that I used to work with under the Puget Sound Partnership for Marine Mammal Working Group. There's a whole action agenda for Puget Sound to restore Puget Sound, to reduce contaminant levels. Orcas and Chinook salmon are actually one of these indicator species that helps us gauge how we're doing on reducing contaminants in our system. And there's also a number of marine groups at Washington state agencies. The Department of Ecology is in the lead for a lot of this. EPA, NOAA and EPA work together to look at one other contaminant that's in the whales, the PBDEs, they're flame retardants, and newer and non-banned, like some of the legacy contaminants like PCBs. And also we worked with the Canadian group that works on environmental contamination and climate change as well. So this is a broad issue throughout the range of the whale. So it's transboundary. It's at all levels of local, county, state, federal, international. The recognition of how contaminants can affect the health of endangered species and their habitats. There's a number of ongoing health projects to help us better understand those links. How does the contamination travel up the food chain? How does it affect the killer whales? I had a great opportunity to get out on water and scoop up some of that whale poop myself. There's also conservation canine dogs that are trained to sniff the poop and help the researchers collect it. It's amazing. So we're collecting all this health information. We're going to put it all together in a health database. And we can even have medical records for individual whales of what contaminant levels we've seen, what body condition they have from the drone photos. It helps us track particular animals of interest, and we think there's a calf that's not doing well, or a number of whales that are in poor body condition. I mentioned the fecal sampling. There's also great drone sampling to get breath. It doesn't show up very well here tonight. This is a drone about to fly through the blow of a killer whale to collect that mucus and the droplets from the whale's breath, and we can look for contaminants as well as hormone activity and just give us some indicators of the health of the whales. I mentioned some of the genetic studies. Those are ongoing. our partners at CDOC Society and Center for Whale Research have looked at skin changes. And there's a great link to a video which we can make available to you all of that looking at the health of the whales. It's really unfortunate when we do have a stranded whale that ends up on one of our beaches. But that gives us an opportunity to look at what might have caused mortality for a stranded whale, what diseases, what contaminant levels, what's the health of that animal, and why might it have died and washed up on a beach. So we're working with veterinarians and all kinds of people to learn about the health of whales. And many of these studies are looking at contaminant connections. How are contaminants and birth and death, those females, how are they able to offload, and how long does it take for them to accumulate more contaminants again? Lots going on in this arena. So I just want to give a shout out to our research community who's working very diligently on these issues. So that's a lot about the whales themselves and how their health might be affected. I also talked about some salmon issues. So what about habitat? Well, the Endangered Species Act has a protection for endangered and threatened species, which is critical habitat. And this is identifying what features are out of the habitat that are really necessary to conserve endangered species. And so shortly after the listing in 2005, we designated inland waters of Washington, here on the San Juans, the Port Summer area, all the way down into Puget Sound, and then out the Strait of Guadalupe. We identified how the whales were using these areas. We had lots of sighting data. We had a lot of information about when whales were in different places, when they were feeding, what they were feeding on, and how they might be impacted by different types of activities. We didn't know as much about the coastal habitat, but we worked on an active research program with some satellite tagging, some acoustic recorders, and then just opportunistic sightings that people were able to report to us. And if they had a photo, we might be able to identify that was a southern resident. So in 2021, we were able to add some coastal critical habitat all along the coast, from the border with Canada up here and we're in Washington, all the way down to Port Reyes, California. And I mentioned that this critical habitat protects the features of the habitat. So the features we identified for both these areas, one of them is water quality. We need to ensure that the water quality is sufficient to support healthy whales and recovery of this endangered population. I'll also mention there's a connection with contaminants in the prey feature for critical habitat, and that's the quality of the prey. We need to make sure that their prey doesn't have too many contaminants from the ecosystem that go up the food chain and affect the health of the whales. And also passive conditions, making sure that they can get to all the different parts of their habitat without interference. So we've protected the whales directly. We've got some strong protections in the Endangered Species Act where we look at federal actions to see how those might impact the whales as well as the critical habitat in these features. We don't always get to look at the federal level for state or local or county or city actions. So there's a lot of local attention that we need beyond just the federal protections. And I had the honor and the privilege to sit on Governor Inslee's Orca Task Force several years ago. And I give a lot of credit to this task force. They put out a list of recommendations that were very consistent with a lot of what I told you was in the NOAA ESA recovery plan. They also tackled some really tough threats to the whales, to our environment, to the ecosystem. And this is the second report that came out. And it addressed climate change and human population growth. These are some of the overarching things that are that trickle down to affect those, exacerbate the threats or create new threats. So I just wanted to call out one of the goals in that second list of recommendations from the Orca Task Force, and that was to reduce the threats from population growth and development on important habitats, sensitive ecosystems, and the food webs that southern resident orcas rely on. There's a lot more detail in these plans about how state agencies, about how local communities can implement protective measures. And they also highlight some of the strong protections in Washington State. The Growth Management Act, the Shoreline Management Act, These are strong things that are in place, but as the plan points out, it needs support to implement them, and we need accountability to make sure that those acts are being implemented, including SEPA. And we even had some recommendations to improve the SEPA process to focus more on some of the threats for some resident killer whales. So maybe it's time for some special focus on trees under SEPA and a new checklist that will help people understand those connections and those linkages. So I just wanted to leave with one note to say, I don't think many of you are new to Orcas. It was so exciting to see so many of your hands raised that you are aware of them in our backyard and that you've seen them. June is Orca Action Month. The states of Washington, Oregon, and I think even California now, some of our little nonprofit groups have talked to the governors and had June declared as Orca Action Month. There's a link. Oh, you can see it. It's in white. It's orcamonth.org, I think is what it says there. But if you Google Orca Month in Washington, this event was on there, but there's also a whole host of things that you can get involved in, whether you want to just learn more about orcas and what's needed to support their recovery, or if you want to get your hands dirty and do a habitat restoration project to help improve salmon habitat that will build prey that the whales need and create mechanisms to help with reducing contamination. So I think I'll end it there, and we'll have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
So the first question that we have today says, well, I'm asking this because my friend believes this to be true. Do more and smaller trees replant to provide the same benefits as replacements for the larger trees?
No.
Next question.
It will take a long time. No, the benefits of a tree, the size of a tree, the benefits of the size of the proportion. And not just the canopy area, it's probably the crown bottom. So, yeah, it's going to take a long time for a small tree to say around what really likes tree. So, no, it's going to take a long time for trees to grow and have the other benefits of being more mature.
Okay, thank you. Next question. We have two fun ones to start. Okay. I don't know what that means for the later ones, but okay. Which one is it? Oh, for these two? Dr. Donovan, what's your favorite tree?
I would say it's a split between, because when I like trees is because of the landscape they keep them in, mostly. So Ponderosa pine, and also I love the leaning juniper mountain. Do you want to do a famous tree?
I am partial to those madrona trees on the west side of San Juan Island, combining your tree watching and your orca conservations.
Awesome. So, Lynn, let's stick with you because this is of the same line. If so, who's your favorite whale?
All right, you're putting me on the spot, and I'll be diplomatic and say one of my favorite whales is actually an Oregon resident from the A-Pod, A73. Her name's Springer, and she was alone in Puget Sound and hanging out with the fairies in 2002. And at that time, I worked for NOAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I came out to Seattle to help rescue this orphaned orca calf. We gave her a full health check to make sure she was healthy enough. We fed her some live salmon to make sure she could catch live fish. We brought her back to her A-Pod family group in Canada. It was an amazing story. I could do a whole talk on that. Happy to chat with anyone afterwards. But that was my introduction to the Pacific Northwest and to the killer whales here in our waters. It was fantastic. Oh, I'll have to give one more shout out to Springer. She was a young cat at the time. Now it's 20 plus years later. She's had 2 babies of her own.
Dr. Donovan, do you have a favorite whale?
Okay. They're all babies.
There you go.
I really I'd seen one organ when I was in New Zealand. It was wonderful. And then when I lived in Alaska, I would kayak with whales. And being close enough to whales, you can smell the breath, which is not that pleasant. It's not that adventurous. It's a very unique experience. So, oh,
Excellent. Next question. How does the difference between artificial storm water retention compare in with effect with trees and natural detention near creeks and waterways? Does that make sense?
yeah, I guess it's, things like forest wells, all of grey infrastructure that's built to serve the same purpose as trees. It would all just depend on the circumstances. The one, obviously, some grey infrastructure that's going to have the same benefits as trees, but one thing they won't have is they won't have the co-temperature. So the grey infrastructure isn't going to be theory, the grey infrastructure isn't going to be associated with long crowd, the grey infrastructure isn't going to lower temperature, it isn't going to do a whole lot of things. That's the great thing about trees, is just not just the individual benefit, but the breadth of benefits.
Next question. This one's for Lynne. What kind of contaminants do you typically see in orcas, and what is their source? Factories, tires, etc.
Now, so some of the main contaminants that we've studied in marine mammals, not just the southern residents, are some of those legacy contaminants. I showed you a figure for PCBs. Banned, we don't use it anymore, but there's still atmospheric deposition from places where it is used. It's still circulating in the environment, hard to get rid of. So pesticides, DDT, we can see a difference in the contaminant levels in K and L pod compared to J, because K and L pod spend more time off California. That has a higher DDT signature. I also mentioned the PVDEs, the flame retardants. Those are newer and less regulated. They're in our furniture and our carpets, so our houses don't burn down. So it's all about trade-offs. So what are you trying to protect or address? There's a whole new effort to look at contaminants of emerging concern, and there's the PFAS. Yep, so that's a new one. We know it's in killer whales, but we don't know enough about what levels could cause health problems for the whales. There are people looking at microplastics in the feces. Yes, they're there. We've seen it. Again, how does that affect the contaminant levels in the whales? We don't know yet. And then there's a whole host of things that aren't monitored very well. Pharmaceuticals. Some of my NOAA colleagues have done some amazing studies on salmon, looking at caffeine and cocaine and other types of things that show up in our salmon. Again, we're still learning how they affect the health of the salmon and the whales that eat the salmon. And then, of course, the tire 6 ppdq, really bad for salmon. Kills them. Special killer. That's about all I know. Yeah.
This one's for Geof. It says, is there a reason why you switched from looking at birth weight to cardiovascular and respiratory disease in your studies?
I've looked at a whole range of those outcomes. So if you look at my website, things like asthma, ADHD, child leukemia, a whole range of diseases. In this particular case, I just thought it was being nice to show you kind of something from the beginning of life with birth outcomes, and then something towards the end of life with the chronic diseases and mortality. So it's really just a way of bracketing lifespan, because trees help throughout the lifespan at every stage. Before you're born, before you're even born, trees can affect your health all the way to. I did a study in New Zealand showing people recovering from hip knee replacement surgery live longer and take fewer events. So those stages of that, those were just the practical actions.
So I had a discussion on the way in with my partner, and we've been talking about catching trees and orcas, and my point's always been that it's not a straight line association, right? As Lynn pointed out, the biggest impact to 50 kilowatts of noise, that's surprisingly sound and food, but then you can slide a little off till you get it to running to trees. So this question actually leads into this a little bit, and this might be you saying off your skis. Well, I get, oh, you're going over. Okay. I'm from Colorado, as you know that. Okay. New science shows us the critical importance of functional microbiomes for hosts. Like, it's like you can go. He's back on his skates. Okay. We now know most of the tree's microbiome associates with the roots, and further that the root system is twice as extensive or more as a canopy. What suggestions do you have for integrating these facts, I love this question, into tree protection strategies, which for me, that goes down line to the ornaments?
Okay, yeah, this is a very good question. I've done some work on the biodiversity, tree biodiversity, and plant biodiversity and health. Because yes, the total leaf area of the world of the plants in the world are twice the land area. So it's this vast habitat. And so I've shown that kids who are exposed to loss, tree and plant diversity at low rates of asthma and also low rates of childhood leukemia. So it's a way to get some of you may be familiar with the biodiversity hypothesis. As the world's biodiversity declines, so the rate of immune diseases climb. And so that's a bit of evidence that may be the case. So as we're not exposed to, because for some of you may be familiar with the hygiene hypothesis, the hygiene hypothesis is a better name, I think, Lord Frank's hypothesis. That is, we need to be exposed to some of these ancient microbes for our immune systems to work properly. And also in the rhizosphere, in the soil as well. So biodiversity is good at trees. So when we're thinking about trees, we shouldn't think of them as just being widgets, right? More diverse trees are good for a number of reasons. They can be good for our health, but they also are good from they're less likely to be killed by one pathogen. So all the attributes or the attributes, for example. So more diversity makes it a better health and more resilient tree country. So I think you should move in that direction.
No, that was pretty good. Now I'm really sad because, we were thinking, and I talked to Sandy about this. And Kirsty's like, we cut down the trees on one lot, but you don't realize how they're impacting the trees that are on the lot next door. So I'm just saying, I cut down this tree for my driveway. It doesn't really matter because you're actually rotting from the inside. You can't really happy now. Okay, great. Next one is how has the current administration already impacted research on the Orca? Sorry, that's kind of random. I gotta go for it.
So, starting in January, there's been a tremendous amount of instability and uncertainty about the jobs of federal workers, about the funding available to continue the work that federal workers have been doing. And then it's not just the federal scene. Seeing grant programs taken offline that support all kinds of academic research institutions really, concerns me about the future of funding support for science. I'll also say there's a new executive order about scientific integrity that to me is sort of flips it on its head and connects it to politics as opposed to having that separation of science and political issues. So those are a few things. Personally, a person on my team that works on Orca recovery was terminated and then non-terminated. And I felt that there was a pretty big risk of staying with NOAA in this administration and wondering how I would be able to advance conservation. And so, I chose to take a voluntary early retirement. So that's my personal impacts. And yeah, check out my interview with King 5 News.
And someone who works as a partner with our former federal employees. It's let's go ahead. Yeah, I'm not representing myself. It's been brutal. It's been difficult. We've had such an amazing advocate in this position, particularly when it comes to southern resident killer whales, that to lose the institutional knowledge, the passion, the partnerships that have been lost essentially overnight, given the decisions that folks like Lynne have to make. It's been really difficult. So we're rallying, we're trying to solve it. Lynne didn't go anywhere. She's still obviously on the team, but from the outside, at least right next door, it's been really rough. So.
And one of the lower priority issues, which is again in our recovery plan and in our species and spotlight action plan, is education and outreach to raise awareness about the issues so that people can make informed decisions, whether those people are government agency, state agency, or just concerned citizens who are commuters and homeowners or renters or whatever you buy to consumers. That's the word I was looking for, and voters as well. So. Unfortunately, some of those grants that NOAA provided to our education outreach partners were some of the first things to not have funding or not have the ability to move forward. So that's one. Support.
Keeping the theme going with the positive Orca stuff. Two questions. This is to Lynne, and then we'll keep Lynne then I'm going to combine these two questions. At least with regards to Orcas, is there an abundance of evidence that actions on land have long negatively affected their populations, going back to the listing in the early 2000s? What is the next legal strategy that might be pursued tangential to that? Is critical habitat going to be removed from the ESA?
I'll start with the second part. I have no idea. That's part of the tremendous uncertainty that's out there about. I'm uncertain about changes to the ESA, to critical habitat, to how our laws are implemented. There's a lot that's still uncertain right now. So that I don't know yet. I'm worried about it, but I don't know any concrete actions being taken yet. So now back to the first part. I would say the strongest connection between land-based activities and impacts to orcas are through their salmon prey. Most of the salmon habitat restoration work that's done is in freshwater systems on our landscapes, in our watersheds, in our backyards. And all of those issues for salmon, whether it's habitat or contaminants, whether it's hydropower systems that are in their river systems, hatchery production, harvest actions, all of those things that affect salmon. I'd say the land-based connections are through that pathway. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. The next question kind of feeds into what I do, which is obviously we've given people a ton of information here, and some of it isn't the happiest information, and that often leaves people feeling helpless, can't do anything. So my story, my program is to get people jazzed up, excited to go ahead and do things. So along those lines, Lynne, since the recovery plan offers guidelines for local governments and that it can't require them to follow these guidelines, is there anything people can do that might encourage local governments to follow those federal guidelines and plans?
Sure, great question. And I love to inspire people to take action and be stewards. This is the first step, is actually learning about what the issues are and being able to make informed decisions about how you vote. I mentioned the Growth Management Act, the Shoreline Management Act. There are often public input parts of that process. If they're developing a new growth management plan or a shoreline management plan, or they're doing an EIS under SEPA to look at a development plan in a city, in a county, in the state. So I'd say learn about those opportunities to have your voice heard in those public processes. There's also lots of great groups you can support and find ways to volunteer. I'll share a few things of what I do. I adopt a street, cleaning up my neighborhood and helping keep the stormwater drains clear. I was out measuring trees when my neighbor sold his house, and they were going to tear it down. They did tear it down, and making sure that they had the right size, trees that they're protecting, and the right non-impervious services. So those kinds of things you can do in your own community, your own backyard, and then on the kind of local government political landscape, there's a lot of ways to have your voice heard.
Next question, I assume this is Dr. Donovan. How do trees that are green all year compare in benefits to trees that lose their leaves in the winter?
That's an excellent question. I genuinely not found a huge difference. So in that overall, I split trees into three types. Deciduous flowering deciduous trunk flowering, I didn't find a difference. Maybe probably pregnancy or not so.
Awesome. Next question is to Lynn. Lynn, earlier you showed a light chart showing that 80% of the orca food was Chinook. I don't know the answer to this. I mean, there's one, maybe you do know. Do you have any idea how that compares to their diet 100 years ago?
I don't know.
I don't either. Yeah.
I would love to know.
Right. I mean, you're assuming the photo ID study started in the early 70s, fecal training collection is fairly recent. So,
I will say that high chart was specific to inland waters in the summer. And we do know that their diet changes in the coastal waters in the winter. Because different things, Chinook is not as readily available, and they do switch to other species, and that sort of changes throughout the year. They even eat some bottomfish as well. The current thinking is that it's because the favored Chinook salmon is not around, and that's why they're switching. So they will eat other things. They can eat other things. They might not have as many calories and health benefits. The whales might find it harder to catch other things as well. Those big fatty Chinook salmon are good eating.
either of us. Okay. Back to Geof. Are there some tree types that prove to be better contaminant straws than others?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. No, from pulling it, if you're talking about pulling stuff up from the soil into the tree, then that's probably just a function of size. When you talk about air pollution, it's a function of really two things, which is leaf areas of the tree volume, crown volume, but it also matters how, in particular, like the stickiness of the leaves. So there's different trees that have kind of sticky, hand leaves, micrograss, and that can real surprisingly make a lot of difference in the capacity to intercept air pollution. But pulling stuff up from the soil, that's just going to be a function of how much water they use, and which is mostly going to be a function of size.
And I'll just add a note that, while we mainly focused on killer whales getting their contaminant levels through their prey, they also are susceptible to air pollution as well, just because they are tidal volume breathers and are holding their breath and taking these huge breaths that use a lot of their lung capacity and a lot of surface area. So air pollution is an issue for them as well.
Which figures in the distance for vessels, not just the noises.
Oh yeah, that's a contaminant I didn't mention is the PAHs. That would be an exhaust and other air quality issues.
Questionable. Are salmon bearing streams better off having trees along the bank to provide shade to cool the waters and filter storm water runoff for salmon spawning than healthy orcas? Or do you want less shade on salmon bearing streams?
More shade. Yeah. There are best practices. I think there's probably some requirements as well about maintaining riparian zones on the banks to keep the waters cooler to support salmon health. Oh yeah, large woody debris.
Another killer question. How often do biopsies from each southern resident orca? How often do you take biopsies from each southern resident orca? How much do it needs individually to keep track of their health?
we haven't taken biopsies in decades. It was something we did earlier on in the research program, and now we are using less invasive techniques, looking at contaminants in fecal samples. And we have a couple of opportunities where we can do some comparisons, some paired sampling from individuals where we have a biopsy and some fecal, but there wasn't a ton of overlap in those two techniques, so it's really tough. And then the other opportunity is sampling. We do have an unstranded whale. Then we can do all kinds of sample analysis and contaminant level studies from that and use those to compare to past samples as well. So, yep, we did pass. We're moving on to new techniques now.
Like to follow up to Jeff's comment about evergreens. Do evergreens have more contaminants since their quote leaves unquote aren't falling as often and in lower? I don't know where is that.
I don't know. I mean, one of the greatest things that you fall, you should have fall percent. So you're in a place, it's just not, they'll still fall down and go under. So, and I think that would also probably lead to you, the structure is needles are just a little less, it's just a little less tissue compared to a bigger thing. But the truth is, beyond that,
Okay, final few questions. So this is the last one, guys, and there's one for me. What can we do to reduce harmful storm water runoff?
So some things that people can do every day in their own lives, focus on things like how you maintain your yard. Check out, whale-friendly yards, using less chemicals, contaminants, pesticides. There's also things we can do with our car maintenance and making sure when we're washing cars, we're doing it in a way that doesn't wash more contaminants and break chemicals just right into a storm drain. Geof, what do you tell the kids to do?
For stormwater runoff?
Do they have any? Do they work in their schools and their communities?
Kill Whale Tales has a event called Pod Squad, storm water busters. So we're having them clear. Well, first of all, count the number of stormwater drains in their neighborhood. Make sure they're clear of contaminants, trash, whatever they can. Encourage them to best water practices at home, like lower pesticides if possible. Wash your car wash. What goes on the lawn goes down the drain, things of that nature. So as we wrap up, I would like to thank you for coming again. Thank you for being part of the solution. We are in our way of making a difference, and we raise all our voices to get stuff done. That's what I'm telling kids. We have lots of groups that are here today with their tables, tons of information, a lot about whales, right, and trees over here as well. Check those out before you leave. But everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of that solution, and have a good night. Thank you.